A hero's welcome for Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-Wen as she arrives in New York on a stopover on her way to Central America. But this is far more than just popping in to see an old friend. The Taiwanese president is also scheduled to visit the US on her way back from Central America, with rumours that she will be meeting US House Speaker Kevin McCarthy as she desperately tries to shore up support for an increasingly possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Earlier this week, China resumed diplomatic ties with Honduras, which subsequently cut ties with Taiwan, and the Taiwanese are determined not to let the Chinese influence spread throughout Central America. This Chinese influence is seemingly worrying the US as well, as Vice President Kamala Harris is currently touring Africa, a continent that has largely strengthened ties with China in recent years, with Joe Biden set to visit later this year. China also strengthened ties in the Middle East, an important location for the US, by mediating the normalization ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia earlier this month. Beijing is irate with Tsai Ing-Wen's American visit, claiming that it could lead to a, quote, serious confrontation between China and the US, amid claims that the US is undermining the One China principle, which states that Taiwan is under Chinese rule and not a sovereign state. But is this just a leader visiting an ally, or does Tsai Ing-wen have any ulterior motives? With China and the US both going on the charm offensive to less economically developed countries, are they trying to form new alliances for a potential Cold War? After then US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan last August, Beijing conducted a series of drills around the Taiwan Strait. Could we see this again, or perhaps something more severe? Is Tsai Ing-wen's American visit an intentional provocation?
So let's get to it, gentlemen. Is Tsai Ing-wen's American visit an intentional provocation? As always, we'll begin with our quickfire round. 30 seconds each will out your initial stance on the matter, and we pick it up from there. So, Alexander B. Pevzner, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Well, whether the trip is a provocation it depends on where you sit on the global political divide. You know, from Taiwan's perspective, this is a trip intended to shore the diplomatic network of Taiwan, which has been, hemorrhaging recently. So this is a normal visit. Obviously the U.S. wants to show support to Taiwan because it's part of a bigger competition between U.S. and China.
Yes, and we'll dive in deeper to this bigger competition later on. Jason Smith, your thoughts?
Well, with the leader of Taiwan traveling to America, my home country, I am concerned. However, if this visit is unofficial in nature, then that visit is not really anything of concern. However, if she does meet with U.S. leaders in an official capacity, then there is the potential for China to take actions to denote that it disapproves of that visit. But at the same time, Taiwan's former leader is currently in China's mainland. So perhaps this is a way to hem in this visit.
Dan Perry, last but not least, your thoughts?
Tsai has been to the U.S. I think 7 times during the 7 years of her presidency. So in a way, it's a continuation of the awkward status quo. The meeting with McCarthy is somewhat unusual. He's very high level, but not from the ruling party. It is a delicate context given China's increasing bellicosity on Taiwan and the speculation that they are preparing for an invasion, with Russia's fiasco in Ukraine offering both maybe a precedent but also a cautionary tale for China.
Yes, and we will relate to the Ukrainian model, if you will, later on. But let's begin, and please let's feel free to interact from this point onwards, gentlemen. Let's begin with a very simple question: is Taiwan the first battle of the next war? Alexander Pevzner.
Well, certainly one of the first. The island of Taiwan certainly punches above its weight geopolitically, technologically. It is the leading place for the manufacturing of advanced semiconductors, and very important for global technological supply chains. We have seen the U.S., for example, asking or persuading TSMC, the leading Taiwanese company, to invest in the US to build this advanced capacity also in the US, because currently all of this semiconductor capacity is in Asia. Of course, geopolitically, if China, as U.S. generals claims, if China gets Taiwan, that it will, be a blow to U.S. credibility and its alliance network.
Yeah.
Of course, China sees it differently. For China, it's a remnant of the unfinished civil war.
And in this respect, Jason Smith, is it caught between the superpowers? As in, is Taiwan merely a pawn?
I think I don't think it's really fair to consider Taiwan a pawn. Taiwan actually considers all of China part of itself. And it actually has its own one China policy where it considers itself part of China's mainland. China's mainland feels the same way. And I don't think that there's going to be a war, at least not one that China, the PRC, wants to start with its own island. It's doing everything in its power to peaceably reunite. Its preparation for war is to defend itself from outside interference, from actors like the United States. So the hostility really isn't coming from the PRC. The PRC is preparing to defend its own territory.
I have to say, how on earth is China preparing to defend in the context of Taiwan? They're not expecting an invasion from the island or from the archipelago. They're not expecting an invasion from the United States. I mean, clearly, I think it's meant to project an ability to invade Taiwan. I do not know if they have any intention of doing any such thing, but that appears to be what they're attempting to hint at for whatever advantage they think that gets them, no?
If other nations began putting military hardware into Hawaii, the United States would take actions to see that military hardware was dealt with. China wants Taiwan to be peacefully reunited with the mainland. But if other countries began interfering militarily by putting boots on the ground, for example, to train troops in Taiwan, then that changes the status quo. The United States is the one that is interfering in the region and decreasing stability.
I have to say, China will not be peaceably reunited with Taiwan unless the Chinese Communist Party no longer rules China. That's just not going to happen. So this status quo will remain for the foreseeable future unless China invades. And I think that's the answer to Ellie's question, fundamentally. If Taiwan will be a major and maybe the first element of the new hot war if China so decides. And the fear in the world is that Xi, given that he's more nationalistic than recent Chinese leaders and has more power concentrated in him than most recent Chinese leaders, so you have one person who may be unpredictable, as with Putin, that maybe he might decide to do something so reckless. I personally doubt it, but that's the fear, and that's the inflection point.
So in this respect, gentlemen, staying with the Chinese sentiments here, if there are any sentiments when we're talking about geopolitics, merely an excuse or a real sense of threat? This is what the White House has to say.
I would also remind everyone that this is not new. Every Taiwan president has transited the United States. President Tsai Ing-Wen herself has transited the U.S. 6 times since taking office in 2016, each time without incident. In all previous transits, she met with members of Congress as well as state and local officials and had public appearances. She has also transited through both New York and Los Angeles before.
So does China genuinely feel provoked, or is it just, trying to pick up a fight for the sake of it, Alexander?
I will address your question, but there are a few mistakes and misunderstandings that I will have to address. First of all, to the best of my understanding, Taiwan does not claim China. It used to be during military rule in Taiwan, but
consider reading the Constitution.
Clear that, Taiwan has given up its demand on China. China certainly still demands Taiwan. If I'm not mistaken, Taiwan canceled the Unification Council around 2005. The Unification Council that, for example, exists still in South Korea. Secondly, it's true, for example, if we look at the policies of the US and other countries, including Israel, that, accepting the one China principle in the sense that China, the People's Republic of China, is in the United Nations and Taiwan is not, then this stems from a series of agreements reached in the 70s and 80s between United States and the People's Republic of China. But in those documents, China committed to peaceful unification with Taiwan. Peaceful. Okay, so I don't think that, claim that we would support peaceful unification, but if this fails, just like the Communist Party is claiming that we will take other steps, then this is not obviously acceptable.
I think the fear around the world is that not every statement made and agreement signed will be forever stuck to, basically. And that it's not inconceivable that China, being essentially a dictatorial country, will do whatever it feels it's in its own interest. I mean, remember that Putin swore he wouldn't invade Ukraine. So the trust here is simply not maximal. And maybe that's part of the problem. We probably should be looking at ways to restore trust.
Yeah, and one more thing, after the previous speaker, Nancy Pelosi, visit to Taiwan last year in August, China conducted a series of military drills around Taiwan. And the current speaker, Kevin McCarthy, planned to visit Taiwan. And to reduce tension, I think, this was,
instead of him going there,
visiting the U.S., which there's precedent to it, of course.
So Jason Smith, as Mr. Pevzner just illustrated, the previous reaction on behalf of China was certain. How contained will be the reaction this time around, if indeed happens?
Well, I wanted to correct a few mistakes that my colleagues have made. And even though they may have erased certain panels for reunification, Taiwan's constitution very much claims all of China, as it always has. And even the former leader of Taiwan, who is in China now, Ma Ying-jeou, also said we are all Chinese. So the hope for peaceful reunification is very much there. And China's mainland, the PRC, does not intend to take militarily the island of Taiwan. This is a last resort, but it does put all options on the table.
Okay, and on that note, gentlemen, we do need to take a short break, but hold your thoughts right there, because when we get back, we broaden our discussion, our horizons, and discuss the charm offensives of both Washington and Beijing around the globe. Who's winning, who's losing, so much more to unpack. A few minutes break, and we're back with the summit. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Jason Smith, Alexander B. Pevzner, and Dan Perry. Thank you, gentlemen, for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to our conversation, Taiwan is just one front of the collision course, if you will. Well, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris is on a mission in Africa to woo Africa, if you will. It's Honduras who ditched Taipei for Beijing this week. So let's take a listen.
The political decision made by the Honduran government to choose to stand with the other 181 countries in the world, to recognize and pledge to abide by the One China principle, and to establish diplomatic relations with China without any preconditions, is in the fundamental interest of Honduras and its people. It fully demonstrates that upholding the One China principle is a right choice that serves the greater good of the international community and conforms to the trends of the time. It is a shared aspiration of the people that represents an irreversible trend.
So let's get to it, gentlemen. Another quick fire round, 30 seconds each. Are the U.S.-China trauma offensives across the globe or a hot sign for a cold war? Dan Perry, please take the lead.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We definitely are on the cusp of a Cold War between the democratic world and the autocratic world, and China wishes to be the leader of the latter. And I think Putin's missteps in over the past year have given China an opening to be just that. So we see it in their flirtation with Putin and their sponsorship of Iranian-Saudi rapprochement, but closeness to Iran in general. We also see it in the U.S. Summit for Democracy this week and so forth. So yeah, for sure. And the question is how to prevent it from becoming a hot war. So invasion notions of Taiwan aside, I think what's needed is an outstretched hand and some optimal continuation of trade.
Mr. Pevzner, your thoughts?
Absolutely, but it didn't. This new nascent Cold War did not start today. You can say maybe from 2017, from the Trump administration, and certainly the Trump's attitude towards U.S. allies certainly gave China an opening. But you see a big effort on China's part to court the global South, to court the Middle East, as we've seen with Saudi Arabia and Iran, to court Asia, to try to boost its own influence.
Last but not least, Jason Smith, your take?
Well, I certainly think there are people, individuals in the United States and the West who would like there to be a Cold War and seem to think there is. But considering the United States' number one trade partner is China, that was not the case during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Tim Cook is here in Beijing. Elon Musk does business in Beijing, and there are two Disneylands in Beijing. So really, no, there might be similarities, but certainly it's not like a Cold War.
Yes, we're having some technical difficulties hearing you well, Jason Smith, so we'll try to fix that. But let's do begin from the point you just made, sir, and let's feel free to interact, of course. Mr. Pevzner, are tech giants caught between the escalating U.S.-China tensions, or are they undermining or underlying this superpower battle?
You bet they're feeling the heat. I mean, it's true that Tim Cook is in China, but nevertheless, Apple has been busy in the past few years moving at least some of its production lines, or adding new production lines in India. The U.S. passed the CHIPS Act, gave all kinds of various restrictions of the export of advanced semiconductor manufacturing technology to China. We know that Congress will consider a kind of a reverse investment act. In other words, like CFIUS vets investments in the U.S., Congress is considering a committee to vet outgoing investments to prevent more investments from China. So probably they're, living on borrowed time, I suppose.
Yeah. No, I would add that this is another case where all of this connects back to the Ukraine war. The great lesson of the war in Ukraine is that the U.S. and the West do not want to be dependent in any way that is major on a bad faith player in the world, and China has at this point been designated as such. That's why there is the embargo on advanced technology to China. That is why there will be absolute hysteria if China comes anywhere close to controlling Taiwan, because of Taiwan's dominance in the global semiconductor market.
And let's roll back to the Middle East, if you will. We cannot underestimate the importance of the Saudi-Iran deal. Nonetheless, the Chinese mediation here, has China simply, shattered the assumption that the U.S. is the dominant superpower in the Middle East?
I mean, the U.S. has been inactive of late, that's true. And the Biden administration is seen as something of a weak player in the Gulf especially, maybe the one region of the world other than Russia that kind of admired Trump. And so there is an opening for China for sure. And they were quite successful when it comes to Saudi and Iran. And that is a warning, I think, to the West, that there is a player that has ambitions on the world stage, not only in Africa and not only in Central America, where we see they've made inroads on the Taiwan issue, getting countries to abandon their relations with the island.
So Latin America, the Middle East, Africa. Is Europe the next target, Jason Smith? Is Beijing determined to be the one to broker peace between Moscow and Kyiv?
Well, I think certainly they're going to try. Honestly, in my own opinion, I don't think the United States will allow Ukraine to make peace with Russia on the terms that China is offering. However, I do think that China is becoming a major player in Europe via the Belt and Road and other mechanisms. One of our other guests mentioned we should be reaching out with trade, and that's precisely what I think as well. If we can tie the United States and China through trade, we can create better relationships moving forward for everyone.
Dan Perry, I do want to stay on the Ukraine question here. Is it a potential cooperation between Beijing and Washington to broker peace there together?
Well, that depends on whether either side wants it. But more than anything, it depends on Putin. I mean, I think there will be great capital that attaches to any global player that gets Putin to somehow climb down from the disaster that he has made in Ukraine. So the potential's there, but it largely depends on Putin more than China and the U.S. It's interesting that you raised the question, though, because that scrambles the equation here. I think there is something very interesting going on in terms of the dynamics governing the world order. We appear to be in something of a binary era. I myself mentioned autocracy versus democracy, but the situation with Taiwan in particular suggests something else, because the U.S. in particular, for example, is in a maximally undignified situation vis-a-vis Taiwan. They recognized one China in order to draw Beijing into the global fold as a somewhat normal player, and that succeeded, and it brought prosperity. But on the other hand, they're committed to defend Taiwan, which appears to be a completely unresolvable contradiction, and yet, despite that, has been essential, I think, for world peace and prosperity, which goes to show that not everything in life is really binary.
Mr. Pevzner, black and white world or not so much?
No. Many shades of gray. I'm not going to say 50.
Exactly.
I want to tie a few strands here together. Just to, I agree with Dan, but only to a point. Let's try to connect Ukraine and the Middle East. Saudi Arabia and Iran. China has leverage in the sense that it's the biggest, trading partner of these countries. And please notice that all these three countries, China, Iran, and especially Saudi Arabia, wanted to use this deal to signal to the U.S. Okay.
Yeah.
Ukraine is different. Contrary to accepted wisdom, I think China has zero leverage over Russia. The only person who can solve the Ukraine problem is President Putin of Russia. But I agree with Dan in the sense that, of course, there are contradictions in the U.S. position towards Taiwan and China. That was the whole point. In the 70s, when these communiques were issued, the idea was to square the circle, and it worked. It was a brilliant idea, but the world moved on. And to be honest, both China, the U.S., and Taiwan all have changed the status quo, which shows us that we need a new agreement.
Oh, okay. Gentlemen, on that note, we have to end our discussion. Dan Perry, Alexander B. Pevzner, and Jason Smith, thank you so very much for your time and insights.